You know, America and China have something in common. We both think we're exceptional, which makes us not very exceptional. But there's a difference, I think. America's exceptionalism goes together with a claim to universalism, with a claim that we have a model we want, or we insist the whole world follow, which may be foolish, but still, it's a claim. And in thinking about this question, can China lead, I realized I didn't have an answer. I don't know if China can lead or not in the present. But I do think we could ask the question, does China think it has something that's universal? And that, if I ask that as an historical question, has China led? Then it's much easier for me to answer. After all, I do Gudaishe, right? I'm an historian and I don't know much about the present. But what does it mean to lead? What does it mean to be able to see yourself as having something that's universal? Well, let's divide it up a bit. Let's talk about institutional structures. China, for a good part of its history, represented what it meant to be a modern state, a well-organized, efficient, thorough state. And its institutions were adopted in Korea, in Japan, and Vietnam. For some parts of its history, China led as a center of culture. Its poetry, its version of history, its Confucian classics, its way of painting, eating with chopsticks, living in cities that had a grid layout. All this was a Chinese cultural model, and others adopted it. Not only that, its philosophies of Confucianism and Neo-Confucianism later claimed that it had something that all people could share. There's a wonderful 16th century novel. This is the point at which the Portuguese and the Spanish have interaction with China. And the novel, maybe it's early 17th century, has a woman from China going to marry the son of the king of Folangi, meaning just generally Europe at the time, Portugal, Europe. And the goal is to bring one hua to Europe, right? So that's that sense that we have culture, that we can share it, is there. In fact, that culture with examination systems, a way of choosing officials, became the model for the British civil service, which then influenced the American civil service. In religion, there have been periods when China was a great source of religious models. The kind of Buddhism we see in East Asia comes from China. It was the Chinese version of Buddhism, a Buddhism that accepted the authority of the state, that was adopted in East Asia. Economically, in the Tang, when the Tang was the greatest country in the world, the largest cities, the biggest market, well, that reappears to some extent in the late Ming too. Many of you may not know that in the late 16th century, in the 17th century, on into the 18th century, 30% of the silver that was mined in the Americas, in the New World, flowed to China. It had the largest market of any country in the world. But there's also China leading through its military power. And I think we probably should not underestimate that. China established itself as a leader in the East Asian and the eastern part of the Eurasian landmass through military conquest, through wars of aggression in the north, in the west, and in the south. And although within China there were always debates about how far Chinese military power should be extended, by and large, the government sided with those who said, let us extend our military power and conquer those around us if we can. It didn't always work, and sometimes there was a high price paid for it. And that extended to the oceans as well. Today we talk about how wonderful it was that Zheng He in the early Ming and the Yongle period sailed across the oceans. But perhaps we forget that one of the roles of Zheng He and his fleet was to settle the peace in Southeast Asia, to remove kings and rulers and replace them with others that would be more friendly. And when we think about that little question of those islands and the South China Sea today, we might keep in mind that there's a history there as well. The question of can China lead is, historically speaking, not a problem. China has led in many different ways at many different periods. How all this will go together in the present is a question I leave to my colleagues here.
Thank you.